Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a case that's been all over the news, the Idaho student murders.
Yeah, this one has really captivated a lot of people, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's just tragic. And in November 2022, you had 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves,
And the Kernodle.
Anette Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were stabbed to death in their off-campus rental house. Just awful.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, it just shocked the community. Everyone was just looking for answers.
Yeah.
It baffled investigators for a while. There were very few leads and a growing sense of fear.
Right, yeah.
But after weeks of intense investigation, they finally zeroed in on Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student in criminology, would you believe it, at a nearby university.
It's crazy how that all unfolded, right?
Yeah.
So as this case has progressed, we've gotten a chance to look at some court documents, news reports, really try to dig into the evidence that was presented during the pre-trial hearings. And it's become clear that DNA evidence is going to be absolutely central to this case.
Yeah, it's really shaping up to be a fascinating legal battle, isn't it? I mean, the prosecution is presenting a pretty compelling case. And there is DNA evidence that was found on a knife sheath at the crime scene.
So this sheath was found right next to Madison Mogen's body.
Yes.
And the DNA on that sheath, they've directly linked it to Bryan Kohberger.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, the way DNA technology has advanced is incredible. It's almost like something out of, like a sci-fi movie. And this case really highlights a particularly powerful technique called Investigative Genetic Genealogy, IGG. Have you heard of this?
Yes. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
It's amazing. It can connect seemingly unrelated individuals through their DNA. So how does the IGG, how does it actually work?
Well, imagine you're trying to solve a crime, right? You have DNA from the scene, but it doesn't match anyone in like the traditional law enforcement databases.
Right.
With IGG, investigators can upload that DNA profile to public genealogy databases and search for potential relatives of the suspect. So essentially, they're building a family tree based on genetic connections. It's really clever.
So that means even if I haven't submitted my own DNA to one of these databases, a distant relative who could inadvertently provide a link in the chain that leads investigators to me.
It's incredible.
That's both impressive and kind of unsettling, don't you think? To think about the implications.
Absolutely. It raises significant questions about privacy.
Totally.
And consent in the digital age, really. I mean, in this case, the defense team actually tried to have the DNA evidence from the sheath. They tried to get it thrown out. They argued that the use of IGG violated Kohberger's constitutional rights.
Interesting. So what happened? Did it work?
No, not this time. The judge ruled that the DNA evidence obtained through IGG was admissible in court.
Okay, so the prosecution has this, seemingly at least, pretty strong piece of evidence linking Kohberger to the crime scene.
That's right.
But there's a twist.
Yeah, there always is, isn't there? The case is definitely not straightforward. So, in addition to the DNA on the knife sheath, investigators found 2 other samples of unidentified male DNA at the crime scene.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and these samples are labeled unknown male B and unknown male D. They've added another layer of complexity to this whole investigation.
So the defense has got to be looking at that, right?
Absolutely. They're seeing it as a potential weakness in the prosecution's case. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally.
So one of these unknown male DNA samples, unknown male B, was found on a bloodstain, of all things, on a handrail inside the house.
Pretty creepy, right? And given the nature of the crime, a blood stain on a handrail is certainly something that makes you wonder.
Definitely.
The other sample, unknown male D, was discovered on a glove found outside the house near a trash can. It's like, who do these belong to?
So you have these 2 samples of male DNA found in significant locations related to the crime scene.
Exactly.
Neither of them belong to Kohberger.
So if he acted alone, as the prosecution is saying, why is there this other male DNA there?
Well, that's exactly the question that the defense is raising, right? They're arguing that the presence of this untested DNA casts doubt on the prosecution's theory that Kohberger acted alone.
Right. So does this DNA, could it belong to someone totally unconnected to the crime, just like a random trace? Or could it point to the possibility of someone else being involved?
It's possible, isn't it? I mean, those are the questions everyone is asking about this case. And what's really interesting is the prosecution, so far, they haven't tested these unknown DNA samples against any databases. They haven't even pursued further analysis using IGG.
That's interesting. So they're not even trying to find out who it belongs to.
Not yet, anyway.
It seems like a risky move. I mean, couldn't that potentially backfire?
It could, couldn't it? It seems like they're really banking on the strength of the DNA evidence from the knife sheath. They're thinking that's strong enough to outweigh any uncertainty
Oh, right.
about the other samples.
But by not testing it, they're leaving that door open, right?
Yeah.
For speculation and for the defense to sort of create their own narrative.
Exactly. And that's what they're doing. The defense is saying, hey, look, this is a rush or incomplete investigation. Maybe they're even trying to hide evidence
Oh, wow.
that goes against their theory.
So we have this kind of battle of narratives developing here.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, you have the prosecution. They're pretty confident about that DNA evidence on the knife sheath. They're like, this is it. This links him to the crime.
Right.
But on the other hand, you've got the defense pointing at these untested DNA samples. And they're saying, hey, look, this could be a crack in the prosecution's theory. We don't really know the whole story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then to make it even more interesting, we have the eyewitness testimony from one of the surviving roommates. This just adds a whole other layer of complexity to the case.
Oh, yeah. And it's become a real point of contention, hasn't it, between the prosecution and the defense?
So this is where DM comes into the picture.
Right. She's one of the 2 roommates who survived the attack. And she told the police she actually saw a masked intruder in the house on the night of the murders.
Oh, wow.
And DM's testimony is super important because it potentially gives us like a firsthand account of what happened that night.
So what did she say? What did she tell them?
She described this intruder as a tall, athletically built man. Said he was dressed in black clothing, wearing a mask, and had like these bushy eyebrows.
Okay.
But as is often the case with eyewitness testimony, there are some inconsistencies, and it's a bit tricky to say how reliable it is.
So the defense is trying to discredit her.
Absolutely. I mean, they're pointing out that she admitted to being, intoxicated that night.
Right.
And they're saying, well, her memory might be impaired.
Right, could be unreliable.
Exactly. And they're also pointing to inconsistencies between the different interviews she's had with law enforcement. Like they're saying, look, her story has changed a bit over time.
Okay, so they're really trying to raise those doubts about her ability to remember everything clearly, especially after going through something so traumatic.
Absolutely. It's a pretty classic defense tactic, isn't it? To scrutinize the details and look for any discrepancies that might cast doubt on the witness. But to be fair, I mean, they do make some valid points. Memory can be tricky, especially under those circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
So the judge, after looking at all the evidence and hearing DM's testimony, he actually found that her descriptions of the intruder were pretty consistent across her interviews.
Oh, wow.
And despite those memory lapses, he decided that she was a credible witness.
So the jury will be allowed to hear her testimony?
That's right. But it will be up to them to decide how much weight they give to it. They'll have to weigh those inconsistencies against what the judge said about her being credible. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. So we have this really captivating courtroom drama setting up. We have compelling DNA evidence, but there are these unanswered questions about those other DNA samples.
Right.
We have an eyewitness who might have seen the killer, but her memory is being challenged.
Exactly. I mean, it's such a complex case with so many different parts, and it really raises that fundamental question. Can the prosecution actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bryan Kohberger and Bryan Kohberger alone is responsible for the murders?
It's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds. We were talking about those unknown male DNA samples found at the crime scene.
Right.
And it's really interesting that the prosecution has decided not to do any more testing on those samples. It seems kind of risky, considering they could have some really important information.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they just want to rule out every single possibility, especially with the defense using it as a point of contention? It's like, what are they thinking?
Well, it's a gamble for sure. The prosecution is probably thinking that the DNA evidence from the knife sheath is so strong, like it's a smoking gun,
Yeah.
They're betting that it's going to be enough to kind of overshadow the uncertainty around those other samples.
Yeah.
They're basically saying, look, this DNA on the sheath, this is the direct link to Kohberger. These other samples, they don't really matter.
But by not testing them, aren't they just opening the door for all kinds of speculation?
Oh, absolutely.
Lets the defense kind of spin their own story, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what they're doing. The defense is saying, hey, this investigation was rushed. It wasn't thorough. Maybe they're even trying to hide evidence that doesn't fit their theory.
Wow, it's getting intense.
It is, isn't it?
So are they just trying to scare the jury? Like make them think they might convict the wrong person?
I think that's definitely part of it. They're playing on those fears, right? Like, nobody wants to send an innocent person to prison.
Right, of course.
especially in a case like this where you're talking about the death penalty.
Yeah.
It's a powerful argument. They're basically saying, are you really comfortable with this? There are still unanswered questions, other DNA at the crime scene, and you want to convict this guy.
I mean, it does make you think, right?
Yeah.
But how much weight can those samples actually carry if they haven't been tested?
Right. That's the question.
It feels like the defense might be overplaying their hand a bit, no?
Yeah, it could be a gamble, couldn't it?
Yeah.
They're hoping that just the mystery surrounding these samples
Right.
will be enough to plant some seeds of doubt in the jury's mind, even if there's no real evidence connecting them to someone else. It really raises that question about the burden of proof, doesn't it?
Yeah, like whose job is it to explain everything?
Exactly. Does the prosecution have to rule out every other possibility, or is it enough for them to just show that Kohberger is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, even if there are still some questions?
That's a good question, yeah.
And it's something the jury will have to decide.
Okay, so let's get back to the DNA evidence itself for a minute. During the pretrial hearings, we heard from forensic experts.
Yeah.
Right? And they talked about all the different types of DNA testing that are used in investigations. Can you break it down for us? Like, what are the differences and how could they affect this case?
Sure. So one of the experts, her name is Rylene Nowlin, and she manages the forensic lab for the Idaho State Police.
Okay.
She explained that there's something called STR testing. This is what's used in COCUS, the National DNA Database.
Okay.
And it analyzes these things called short tandem repeats in the DNA.
Okay.
This type of testing is really good for identifying individuals or for like paternity tests and stuff.
Right.
But it doesn't give you a really complete genetic picture.
Gotcha.
Then you have something called SNP testing, which stands for single nucleotide polymorphism.
Oh, okay.
And this is what they use a lot in genetic genealogy. And this type of testing gives you a much more detailed view of someone's genetic makeup. It can be used to like trace ancestry, identify distant relatives, even predict what someone might look like.
Wow, so that's pretty advanced.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so is one type of testing more reliable than the other? Because I'm trying to figure out what the defense is getting at when they question the reliability of the DNA evidence. What are they suggesting?
I don't think they're saying one type is more reliable than the other.
Sure.
I think what they're trying to do is introduce this idea that DNA evidence, even though it's usually super accurate, it's not perfect.
Right.
They're pointing to things like human error, contamination, maybe even just misinterpreting the results. They're basically saying, okay, the DNA on the sheath might match Kohberger, but are you 100% sure there's no other explanation?
So they're trying to make the jury doubt something that seems pretty cut and dry.
Exactly.
Yeah, because you think of DNA evidence and you're like, oh, that's it, case closed.
Exactly. But they're trying to remind everyone that forensic science, even though it's really advanced, it still relies on humans, and humans make mistakes.
Right, yeah.
So they're trying to shift the focus away from the DNA match and back to that bigger question of reasonable doubt.
Okay, so how will the defense use all this to their advantage? Are they going to try and present another suspect at the trial? Or will they just focus on poking holes in the prosecution's case?
My guess is they'll do both. They'll try to challenge the DNA evidence, but also keep talking about those unidentified samples and all the unanswered questions.
Right.
But we're only seeing a small part of their strategy right now.
Right, of course.
Who knows what else they might have planned for the trial?
It's a high-stakes game, for sure, especially for Kohberger, facing these charges.
Absolutely.
It's incredible to see how both sides are using this complex science, the DNA analysis, to tell their stories. But like you said, DNA is only part of the picture, right? We can't forget about the eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, that's right.
And all the challenges that come with that.
DM's testimony is going to be really important.
Yeah.
Even though the defense is trying to make people doubt her story, the judge has said she's credible. And her saying she saw a masked intruder that night, well, it adds a human element to this whole thing.
Yeah, it makes it more real.
Yeah, and it gives us a glimpse into what those victims might have gone through. It's scary to think about.
Her testimony definitely adds a lot of emotional weight to this case, on top of all the other horrifying details.
Yeah.
It also makes you wonder, how is the jury going to balance everything? The inconsistencies in her statements, but also the fact that the judge thinks she's credible.
That's the challenge of eyewitness testimony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Memory is fragile, especially in a traumatic situation like that.
Absolutely.
The defense will try to use any inconsistencies they can find to create doubt.
Yeah, of course.
And it's a tricky situation for both sides.
Right.
The prosecution wants to show that DM's story backs up their theory about Kohberger,
Okay.
but they also have to be ready to explain those inconsistencies that the defense might bring up.
Right. They have to be prepared.
Yeah, and the defense, they can't attack DM too much, you know? They could turn the jury against them if they do that.
Yeah. It's a delicate balance.
It is. It's a real legal dance. The outcome could depend on just the smallest things, how they present the evidence, how they make their arguments.
Wow. It really sounds like every aspect of this case is a challenge for both the prosecution and the defense.
It is.
They're dealing with all this complicated scientific evidence, the witness testimony that's not totally clear,
Right.
and the pressure of this being a capital murder case. It makes you wonder how they're even preparing for this trial.
Yeah, how do you even begin to approach something like this?
And what are their strategies going to be?
I guess we'll find out when the trial starts. It's a reminder that the legal system is complicated.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to find the truth. And getting justice takes time. You have to carefully look at all the evidence.
Okay. So we've talked about the DNA, the prosecution's approach, the defense's attempts to create that reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
We've talked about the eyewitness testimony and how much weight that might have on the jury. But we need to talk about Kohberger himself now, the suspect. We spent a lot of time talking about all the evidence and everything.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is. It is. But I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about Bryan Kohberger himself.
Okay.
You know, we can't ignore the fact that he was a graduate student in criminology when all of this happened.
Right.
So does that background, does him studying crime, does it give us any insights into the case?
Well, that's what makes it so interesting, right? The prosecution wants us to see Kohberger as someone who was obsessed with crime. Like, maybe his studies weren't just academic, you know? Maybe it was this dark curiosity or even a desire to use what he learned in some twisted way.
Yeah, it's almost like a detective story in reverse.
Isn't it?
Like, instead of solving crimes, he's accused of committing one.
Right. Exactly.
But is that fair? I mean, can we really connect his studies to what he's accused of doing?
It's a good question. The prosecution might be trying to use his background to build a stronger case, but we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Right. Just because he studied criminology doesn't mean he's a criminal.
Exactly. There are tons of people who study this stuff. Criminal justice, forensics, psychology.
Yeah, totally.
They don't all go out and commit crimes.
So there must have been something else, right? Something specific that made investigators focus on Kohberger.
Well, things really changed when they found out that Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra.
A car.
Yeah. And that matched up with what some witnesses had said about a car they saw near the crime scene that night.
Oh, so that's what put him on their radar.
It seems that way, yeah. And then when you add in the DNA evidence from the sheath,
Right.
it all started to point to him pretty strongly.
Okay, so what about the defense? What are they going to do about all of this? Have they said anything about how they're going to fight these accusations? Will they try to say he was somewhere else that night?
They haven't really shown their hand yet.
Oh, okay.
But from what we've seen so far, it seems like they're focusing on poking holes in the prosecution's case,
Yeah.
you know, highlighting the things that don't add up.
So they're going to try and create enough doubt that the jury won't convict him.
Yeah, exactly. They're pointing out the inconsistencies in the witness statements, all the questions about the untested DNA.
Right, right.
They're even questioning how the evidence was handled, you know, just trying to raise any doubts they can.
It's a risky move, but I guess it might be their best shot.
Yeah, it could be. Don't forget, the prosecution has to prove he's guilty. The defense doesn't have to prove he's innocent.
Right, that's a big difference.
It is. They just have to make the jury unsure.
Man, this case is so complicated. The evidence, the witnesses, the legal strategies.
It is, yeah.
It really makes you think about how hard it is to find justice sometimes, especially when you're dealing with such a terrible crime.
It does. And as we wrap this up, I think we should remember the people at the center of this tragedy.
Yeah, of course.
4 young people lost their lives, and their families and friends are going through so much pain.
It's heartbreaking.
We can't forget about that human cost while we're talking about all the legal stuff.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the details.
It is, but at the end of the day, this is about real people and the impact this crime has had on them.
Well said. Well, this has been a deep dive into a case that has really gripped everyone's attention.
It has.
We've looked at the evidence, the legal arguments, the human cost of this tragedy.
And there are still a lot of questions.
Yeah, so many questions. As the trial gets closer, we'll keep following it and sharing what we learn. It's important to stay informed and engaged. This is an important case, and it's not over yet.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the Idaho student murders.
And we'll be back with more updates as soon as we have them. Until then, Stay safe, everyone.